The city was restless, a biting chill in the air creeping into bones, refusing to fade. In a small corner, tucked behind a busy café, John Mitchell sat on a flattened cardboard box, his few belongings bundled tightly beside him. John, a veteran in his late 60s, carried the weight of his military years in every line on his face. His hardened jaw and weary eyes spoke of things most could never imagine. His rough, calloused hands trembled slightly as he held a small cup of coffee, offered by a passing stranger. A simple kindness, rare in his world. To everyone else rushing past on the street, John was invisible, just another shadow blending into the background of their busy lives. But he hadn't always been. Once he was Sergeant John Mitchell, a leader, a protector, someone others looked up to. Yet somewhere between the battles fought on foreign soil and the silent war within his own mind, his life took a dark turn. Coming home, the world he once knew now felt unfamiliar. Friends had moved on, family had grown distant, and the job he was promised had fallen through. Before he knew it, he was on the streets, alone, struggling to find his place in a society that seemed to have forgotten him. Days blurred into each other, each colder and harsher than the last. John had learned to survive on little, rationing meals from shelters, finding solace in rare moments of human kindness. One of those moments came from the cafe manager, who would sometimes offer him leftovers. But that fragile kindness was shattered one bitter evening. Concerned about the cafe's image, the manager made a call to the police. Minutes later, an officer arrived, his expression stern yet not unkind. "Sir, you can't stay here," he said, voice firm. "You're trespassing." John didn't argue. Years of discipline had taught him to follow orders without question. Silently, he gathered his few belongings, preparing to leave. But just as he turned, the officer reached out, gripping his arm. "I'm sorry, sir, but we've had complaints," he added, his tone softer yet unwavering. John's heart sank. He had hoped, just this once, to be left in peace. Instead, he was led away, booked at the station for trespassing. Sitting in the corner of the holding cell, the cold steel bench pressing into his bones, he felt numb. How many nights had passed just like this? Alone, forgotten, unwanted. When they handed him a date for court hearing, he simply nodded. His voice, barely a whisper. Deep down, he wondered, did it even matter anymore? The day of his hearing arrived. John walked into the courtroom, head lowered, expecting nothing. Not sympathy, not understanding. He never did. His mismatched jacket, a donation from the shelter, hung loosely over his frame. His shoes, too tight, pinched his toes. Hands trembling, he clasped them in front of him, waiting for his name to be called. The room was filled with whispers, judgmental glances. To them, he was just another homeless man, someone who had lost his way. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose in respect. A middle-aged woman with sharp, observant eyes, she took her seat and began reading through the stacked case files. Then, she reached John's. She paused. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on him. "John Mitchell," she called, voice strong and formal. John lifted his hand slightly, nodding, his throat too dry to speak. She began reading through his file, but then something made her stop. Her gaze lingered on a line. A second read. Slowly, she looked up, narrowing her eyes, as if recognizing something. "John Mitchell," she repeated, softer this time, almost as if speaking to herself. John shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. Why was she looking at him like that? Setting the file down, she met his eyes, something unusual in her expression. "Mr. Mitchell," she started, voice wavering slightly, "were you, by chance, in the 80th Airborne Division?" The room fell silent. Every ear tuned in. John's eyes widened. Memories, long buried, surged to the surface. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly, nodding. "That was me. I served a long time ago." His voice cracked, the weight of it all almost too much. The judge leaned back, blinking away misty eyes. "Mr. Mitchell," she continued, her voice thick with emotion, "my brother, he served in that same division. He used to tell us stories about a man who saved his life. A man he described as selfless, courageous, a true hero. His name was John Mitchell. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. In an instant, the way people saw John changed. He was no longer just another homeless man. He was a veteran. A hero. John swallowed hard, his throat tight. I just did my duty, ma'am, he murmured, looking down, humbled by her words. I did what I thought was right. The judge cleared her throat, visibly moved. Composing herself, she turned to the courtroom. This man, she declared, voice clear and unwavering, served our country with more bravery than most of us can ever comprehend. And yet, here he stands, facing charges for nothing more than trying to find shelter. She shook her head, turning back to John. Mr. Mitchell, I am dismissing these charges immediately. Furthermore, I am ordering assistance for you, effective today. You deserve more than this. You deserve support, stability, and a place to call home. Tears welled up in John's eyes. And for the first time in years, he felt seen. Truly seen. Not as a burden, not as a failure, but as a man who mattered. The same people who had once cast judgment now looked at him with admiration. Strangers approached, shaking his hand, thanking him for his service, offering words of encouragement. For the first time in years, John felt hope, a warmth he had nearly forgotten, melting the cold that had gripped him for so long. As he left the courtroom that day, tears streamed down his face, not from sadness, but gratitude. The weight he had carried for so many years felt just a little lighter. He wasn't invisible anymore. Following the hearing, the judge personally ensured John was connected with a veterans outreach program. Within days, he had temporary housing, access to counseling, and most importantly, people who genuinely cared. Slowly, he began to rebuild. At the shelter, he found others with stories like his, veterans who had faced hardships after coming home. Together, they formed a small community, lifting one another up. John even began volunteering, mentoring younger veterans, helping them navigate civilian life. One day, passing the café where his troubles had begun, he spotted the manager, the very woman who had called the police. She hesitated, uncertain. To her surprise, John simply smiled, nodding in quiet forgiveness. He had made peace with the past. He was moving forward. Months later, John was invited to speak at a community event honoring veterans. Standing on stage, he shared his story, not just of war, but of struggle, of kindness, of redemption. His words moved the crowd, inspiring many to take action, to support those who had served. By the year's end, John had secured a small apartment, its walls decorated with reminders of his past and new tokens of hope. Among them, a framed photo of his unit, a testament to the brotherhood that had shaped him, and a letter from the judge, thanking him for his service, expressing her gratitude for his sacrifices. John Mitchell's journey was far from over. But for the first time in years, he faced the future with purpose. He was no longer defined by his struggles, but by his resilience and the community that had rallied around him. As he sat by his window, sipping a warm cup of coffee, he allowed himself to dream of brighter days ahead. Subscribe now for more inspiring stories.